Welcome to Die Hard on a Blank, the podcast where we explore the influence of Die Hard on action cinema, one action movie at a time. I'm Philip Gawthorne, and with me as always is Liam Billingham, and today's film is Air Force One.
It's Die Hard on the President's plane. It's also our election special because today is the day after the U.S. election. And I'm hopefully
but we're not going to talk about
great.
it.
I hopefully
we don't know. We don't know how we're going to feel. We're not going to get too bogged down in it, but the timing is interesting.
We did not plan this. We didn't plan this.
It was the stars aligned for this to happen. Yes.
Our guest this week from the great podcast, The Eye of the Duck, Adam Volerich. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. And I also hope that today we're all feeling good and positive about
the future.
You know, the future of the country.
Yeah, that's all our hope. We of course are missing our pal Dom. Dom is without voice currently.
Pour one out for Dom.
Pour one out for Dom.
Dom is suffering from his 28th illness of the month.
That's being a new dad, isn't it?
The pleasures of being a newborn father. Yeah.
Indeed.
So of course I'm stuck with the imperialist British to talk about one of the most patriotic movies ever made. No, I kid. I love.
Two expats here today.
This is amazing.
I actually love it.
We gang up on you. So I will start. Speaking of that, I will come in hot and heavy and say I low-key hate this movie.
Do you really?
I was, and I know that's going to be like kind of an opening salvo. That's like, whoa. I know that Liam, I think, is quite like has some interesting stuff to talk about, and you experienced on the big screen. I don't want to speak for you, but I'm actually like, don't get me wrong. Harrison Ford, obviously one of my favorite movie stars. The director, one of my favorite directors, made In the Line of Fire, one of my favorite movies of the 90s, one of the best sort of political action thrillers ever made. Absolutely love everybody involved in this movie, but I have problems. I have some issues. Personal histories.
Is it that you don't love Murica enough?
Maybe we'll find out.
Well, yeah, no. I'm curious,
American
like
onion.
if it's. Yeah, I'm curious if it's mostly sort of like related to the sort of like themes and messaging like of the film versus the like filmmaking and like, you know, characters, etc.
Over the next 75 minutes,
yeah,
we intend to find out.
Sure.
Why do I hate this movie so much? Like when I don't hate other sort of jingoistic movies, it's kind of,
and there's some really special in this movie. There's a tremendous shot of a helicopter. Yep. There's a plane exploding with another plane below it. There's a lot of juice, but that's hey, you know, I'm excited to unpack this.
We'll get into it. Adam, what's your personal history with this movie? Did you see it when it came out? Has it been in your life a lot? Where are you at with it?
This, much like The Fugitive, which we spoke about the last time I was on the show, I did like a quadruple feature, I think it was, of Air Force One, The Fugitive, The Pelican Brief, and The Firm while I was sick with the novel coronavirus. And I can honestly say that the combination of those four films brought me back to life.
I get that. I get that. So
that was your first time seeing it.
That was my. I mean, I'd seen, you know, bits and pieces of it over the years. There's like, you know, iconic moments that are, you know, in plenty of like clip reels that you can find online, and you know, it's a sort of, you know, cable classic, like always on TV. Flicking through the channels, you would see it. But that was the first time I really sat down and watched the whole thing properly. I have since then watched it 2 more times, and excuse me. I'm very curious where you're coming from, Phil, because I find that, you know, this film is extremely good fun. Like, I have a blast watching it, but like a couple of other films of this time period, they're sort of about nothing other than the events portrayed on screen, and therefore the sort of like what you end up taking away from the film is I think in you know, this film, and then also a film that Liam and I spoke about on Eye of the Duck, Independence Day, another film that Dom and I spoke about around that same time, Mars Attacks. Like, these are films that are very much about sort of like, you know, American, you know, politics during times of extreme, you know, stakes. but they're not actually about anything other than the actual plot of the film. There's no underlying story or message or theme.
They don't even really say too much about the time period in which they're made. I have some thoughts about that. But no, that's a great point. Liam, you are a bit more positive about this film. Is that fair, or what's your history with it?
Well, I will say, just in response to Adam, that I agree with you to a point, because I think like maybe this is the great sort of lesson of this show, is that all of these movies hint at something. They all have like politics embedded in them, and they can sort of like use interesting concepts. There's a few things that Gary Oldman says in this movie that really fascinate me that I want to unpack, but ultimately, I think this movie actually says something very reactionary, and then I'm excited to cover it. My relationship with this movie, I did not see this in the theater. I actually had plans to see it opening day, and I couldn't go. I didn't see it until it was on VHS, months later. Owned it on VHS, watched it fairly frequently. I don't think it stirred any patriotism in me the way that, like, if you listen to our Independence Day episode that we just did on Eye of the Duck with the guys, I don't have a feeling of like positivity or warmth from this movie. But I will say that I recently, to Phil's point, I went to a double feature of this. This was the first film in a Wolfgang Peterson double at the New Beverly. It was Air Force One and In the Line of Fire. And maybe it was that the camera operator for Air Force One was there. I had a blast watching this on the big screen. The production value is huge at certain moments in this movie. And it's Michael Bauhaus shot it, who's a real talent. Of course, he's a legend.
It's one of the best to ever do it.
One of the best to ever do it. Shot some of the greatest American and German movies ever made. I would say my rewatch the past couple days was mixed, and it's actually the third time I've seen it in just as many years, because I watched it when it was on Netflix about 2 or 3 years ago. So this movie is very present for me, and I am mixed, leaning. I'm somewhere in the middle about it. This is the long story short.
Cool. Well, we've got some different points of view then that we can unpack. There were a few things, to the point that you were making, Adam, about like how these films are almost weirdly, hermetically sealed as to, yet at the same time, I think they are, the films that you mentioned, more so this one, are somewhat reflective of, I think, the Clinton years. And I was just sort of thinking, one of the things that we've sort of tracked through the show, and, Die Hard was this kind of inflection point. But if you think back, sort of 70s era political thrillers, it's the Nixon era, and the post-Nixon cynicism. So therefore, it's like Hollywood hates the presidency, essentially. And then you have your parallax views, your Conversations, all of those kind of like classic 70s paranoid movies. Once you move into the Reagan 80s, Hollywood becomes pro-America, anti-foreigner. That's the era of the Chuck Norris movies, the Rambo sequels, not so much First Blood, which is a little bit more balanced and nuanced. But essentially, it's like the American Ubermensch mowing down the other en masse with heavy artillery, right? Like Commando and all of those type of imagery. The shine kind of comes off Reagan towards the end of his presidency, 88, post Iran-Contra and all of that. And then Hollywood's kind of confused, right? Like late 80s, we're like, we don't know how we feel about the presidency necessarily. Die Hard comes out around that time. There's not as many kind of overtly political films. I think it's just kind of like a bit of a dead zone in the Poppy Bush era. And then Clinton era, it's like Hollywood. We have these movies, Independence Day, Hollywood kind of liberal Hollywood kind of starts to fall in love with the presidency again a little bit. And there was an expression, I used the expression prison porn with regards to Con Air. And this to me was like presidency porn. There was a lot of like fetishism of, the trap, the dirt, the stirring music, the Goldsmith music, and all of the hoopla of the presidency's vehicles, and it kind of like glamorizes it all and stuff. It's definitely like shot through a lens of some kind of idealism. Yet I think the irony is this feels like a Reagan era movie. It feels like the kind of movie that Reagan, who famously embraced the Rambo sequels, would have loved. It's like a simplistic fantasy where American exceptionalism triumphs over evil foreigners, essentially.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. I would offer a counterpoint of I would agree with the idea that it's presidential porn, but when we were talking about Independence Day the other week, we dug up this quote. Our researcher Parth Marate dug up this quote from Michael Waldman, who was the president of the Brennan Center for Justice, director of speechwriting for Bill Clinton. And he's talking about this exact era of Hollywood. And he says, liberal Hollywood, which liked Bill Clinton and liked his policies, usually felt uncomfortable in some way with him personally. A lot of liberals in Hollywood thought Bill Clinton was a compromiser. And so Bill Pullman got up there and told it like it is and said what he really thought, which everyone dreamed the real president would do. So I feel like it's presidential porn, but it's really presidential wish fulfillment. It's sort of like, hey, we elected like the liberal, president. We want them to make good on that. We want them to start kicking ass, and doing what we want to make a, better world. And a lot of the time, this person is compromising with the people that we just defeated. And what's the deal with that? And so I think the Independence Day and also this film both really try, I think, to get at the idea of like, well, what if the president had a military background and was capable of flying a plane and capable of actually physically punching the shit out of our enemies?
Yeah. And not only that, it opens with a wish fulfillment speech. It opens with this speech where he's like, we're not going to negotiate anymore. Like, we can't sit on the sidelines. Like, in a weirdly, I don't know, feels contemporary thing of like, we let a genocide continue for too long, right? And it like immediately is like, this is the president we all want. And his sort of national security advisor and his chief of staff are on the sidelines like, what? This guy is committing us to things that like no president would ever actually commit to. So like from the very beginning, this movie is something of a fantasia of like what Americans want.
What if a politician abandoned politics and just, did what was right?
Another movie that explored that subject in a different genre, in a more Capra-esque way, was Dave, and the Kevin Kline movie, which also was sort of about this, a wish fulfillment about a character that what if a president was unencumbered by political compromises. So it was obviously on the minds of Hollywood because that was 1993, so it's post Clinton election. So some interesting stuff. Fast facts. Air Force One was released in the US by Columbia Pictures on July 25th, 1997. Now 9 years after Die Hard. Written by Andrew W. Marlowe, who had a string of like hot spec sales around this time. Hollow Man and End of Days was another.
I love Hollow Man. I'm a huge Hollow Man guy.
I'm also a Hollow Man defender.
Yeah. I mean,
Hollow Man Hive.
I rewatched it during COVID.
It's the Verhoeven film we all forget.
Verhoeven doesn't miss. He just doesn't miss. It took 20 years, but that movie, prophetic and ahead of its time.
Yes, cool. And also, I mean, just amazing sort of images of eyeless Kevin Bacon with the horrible flesh paint on him.
Yeah, movie rocks.
Gruesome. Directed by Wolfgang Peterson, it stars Harrison Ford, Gary Oldman, Wendy Crewson, and Glenn Close, among many others in a stellar ensemble cast who we will get to. On an estimated budget of $85 million, it grossed $315 million and was nominated for 2 Academy Awards. For both Best Sound and Best Film Editing, lost both to Titanic. Well, why don't we move into our next section where we can bring this back to a 1988 motion picture that some of you might be familiar with, in a section that we like to call
Die Hard DNA. The internet's struggling a little bit, but I think I got it.
The alley-oop was a little bit tortured there.
That's all right.
No worries. So this is a classic Die Hard premise, right? Like, right down the middle. Bad guys take over a blank, up to one guy to fight back. Family man, American action hero versus a dastardly European villain played by a bearded British thespian.
I have that in my notes, like as I was watching the movie, like I'm writing down bearded British thespian.
Yeah. I mean, almost all of the same beats are replayed, like the violent takeover. Hero separated from his wife, has to evade capture. Hero dealing with an obstructive female phone operator. Yeah. You have that bit.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that? Yeah. What is that again in this one? It's like he can't get through to the White House, right?
He calls the White House switchboard.
Oh, that's right. They won't
put him through.
Trace the call.
Yeah.
Trace the call.
As in the no shit lady, do I sound like I'm ordering a pizza?
Totally.
From Die Hard. There's also a replay of the Ellis beat, right? Like you've got the villain publicly broadcasting his threat to execute a hostage and then following through on it.
Yeah.
Wait, can I just do something really quickly? Your national security advisor has just been executed. Like, it's just so, his accent is so ridiculous in this movie. It's amazing.
It's great, but even the way that Oldman delivers that, it's so reminiscent of Rickman doing the Mr. Tagaki will not be joining us for the rest of his life. It's so like one-to-one.
Well, the dialogue on that bit after he kills the hostages in Air Force One, it's next time I'll choose someone more important. And in Die Hard, it's sooner or later I might get to someone you do care about. It's literally the same. And you've also got the final standoff where the villain takes the hero's wife hostage. Like Die Hard, it's also kind of a disaster movie to some extent, right? It has some of those like airport or vibes, and of course Die Hard 2 being, plane in peril stuff. You've also got the actor Tom Everett, who plays the National Security Advisor. Jack Doherty appears in Die Hard 2 as the navigator of the Northeast Plane. And please welcome to the stage the Die Hard on a Blank All-Stars. We've got J.A. Preston from Darrow Margin, Glenn Morshower from Under Siege, Philip Baker Hall from The Rock, and my personal favorite, Andrew Divoff, the villain from Toy Soldiers. You remember he was the...
Who is he in this movie?
He's one of the Russian, because I believe I think he speaks like 9 languages, and I think Russian is one of them, and he has some possible... Russian heritage or something like that. I can stand to be corrected on the nuances of which
I didn't recognize him at all. I will say, Adam, the Russian terrorist who is the one that catches them parachuting out of the plane, is a Russian pilot in Independence Day.
Wow. There you go.
So there are like major sort of connections.
I bet there's a bunch of guys that are off doing like Chekhov and stuff who are like thrilled to get this phone call.
Yeah.
And they're like, thank God I can pay.
That guy looks like Russian Paul Auster. Paul Auster, one of my favorite writers. Like he's his twin. So every time I watch it, I'm like, that's Paul Auster, the writer, as a Russian terrorist in Air Force One. Weird.
So we will dig into this movie and our complicated feelings about it in a bit more detail after this quick break. And we're back with our next section of the show, Anatomy of an Action Movie, where we explore the tenets.
We live in a twilight world
of the action movie paradigm. The first tenet of Anatomy of an Action Movie is the premise. So I'll just sort of lay that out for us so we have a little bit of context for our discussion. In case you've been living on Mars and you're unfamiliar with this movie, premise is thus. Shortly after delivering a controversial speech where he vows to never negotiate with terrorists, U.S. President James Marshall, Harrison Ford, finds himself on the horns of a dilemma when the presidential plane known as Air Force One is taken over by a group of ruthless Russian terrorists led by Egor Korshunov, Gary Oldman. With his staff and family now among the hostages, Marshall must work to resolve the situation and save the day, while his squabbling political colleagues attempt to manage the crisis from the ground. The ticking clock is can Marshall and co. defeat the terrorists before his own family are executed and or the plane crashes. So, pretty great. Look, to be fair, great idea. Great premise. Great high concept premise. And of course, there'll be a slew of subsequent like Die Hard in the White House movies, including an entire franchise. One of those ideas that's like, why did no one think of it before, right? It's such a home run like concept, the title, marketability, you get it instantly, right?
Right.
But to what we were saying earlier, right? That's all fine. Like, no doubt, nailed it. But what's this movie? This is one of my favorite open-ended questions. What's this movie about? It's trying very hard to be apolitical, and yet somehow it feels weirdly very political. What do you think are its politics? What's it saying about America? How is it aged? We just want to tee that up for you guys and just kind of throw some red meat into the shark pits here.
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to what you said earlier about this feeling sort of kind of Reagan era, in the sense that essentially what Marshall as a president is pitching here is Team America World Police. Like he's sort of saying like, we not only do we not negotiate, but like we're just going to go around the world, doing whatever we want, like to make sure that we believe that things are now just, which, I think when that's all channeled through the ideology of a single man, the US president, that can easily go from, things that seem like a good idea to things that are like as equally dangerous as perhaps the things that he's trying to disrupt,
Yeah. I have a couple thoughts. One is that this movie, my big criticism of this movie is actually that it has a Harrison Ford problem. And what I mean when I say that, I love Harrison Ford is my dad. Like, I love Harrison Ford. When I see Harrison Ford give interviews now as an older man, I get a weepy. I have a friend working with him right now on a project, and every time he tells me a Harrison Ford story, I get like choked up. I love Harrison Ford. However, it's hard to watch this movie and not think this is a bad Jack Ryan movie. Because the Jack Ryan movies, for all of their sort of like, they're all nuanced, they're all interesting, and in those books, Jack Ryan does eventually become the president, right? So when this came out, there was even some confusion, like, is this a Jack Ryan movie? And it's clearly not. It's like next to a Jack Ryan movie, right? And so it feigns at some nuance. It feigns at actually thinking about some like geopolitical complexities, right? The situation in the ultranationalism in Kazakhstan and the genocide that is happening in these refugee camps that are like never really specified where they are. But like, it's those kinds of things. Like, if this movie began maybe with a Crimson Tide-esque news report, it might feel like it's rooted in something, but it just abandons itself to kind of just like obvious good guy, bad guy, black and white kind of thinking with this gray area in the middle. And it does something even worse because Dean Stockwell plays the Secretary of Defense, right?
Yeah.
And he has this line that I think sticks out in this movie, which is he says, the presidency is bigger than one man, right? And there's something interesting in the idea of like, the president is kind of incapacitated. Like, there's this whole debate in the movie about like, should we relieve him of his power? Should he not be the one who's making decisions here? But at the end of the day, it's like, nah, it's Harrison Ford. Let's tear up this paper. Like, actually, what the movie is explicitly saying is that, no, the presidency is not bigger than one man. It's this guy. And like, if the cult of personality around a famous person being president hasn't revealed itself to be problematic in 2024, then like, it's hard to not read this movie and think like, actually, we need a tough, badass president. He's the only one who can save us. Like, it's very reactionary in my mind. And I think I don't know that anyone was thinking about that in 97, but I do think the movie suffers from a cult of personality around the president, which maybe all movies on the
Independence Day again gets into that towards the third act. But Liam, the Trump campaign has repeatedly used and been asked to stop using the music from this film.
Doesn't surprise me in the least. I probably have heard this.
It's well
but
known
I've
to be like one of his favorite films. Weirdly, the other one is Bloodsport.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, make of that what you will. Here's my question though. You guys have just done a deep dive on Independence Day, on Adam and Dom's wonderful podcast, Eye of the Duck, that we love, that we absolutely love, and we're fortunate to
and it's the greatest movie ever made that we covered, so it's cool that we got to do it. Yeah.
So here's it's fantastic. My question is this. Why am I not offended by the jingoism in Independence Day or in other movies that are like, Top Gun, for example, and Top Gun Maverick, pretty jingoistic movies. They do not offend me at all. Yet this film, for some reason, like really, really bothered me. Why? What's the difference between the jingoism in Independence Day and the jingoism in this movie?
I mean, Independence Day has the benefit of presenting you with a villainous force that has no interest in negotiating, and their only desire is to destroy and harvest, humanity and the resources left in their wake. And also has the additional benefit of it's about the entire world coming together to fight back against that force. It happens to be led by the US president, but it's a movie made for a US audience, and that's what they want to see, right? So I do think by being so black and white, but black and white in a way that is like functional and feels, I wouldn't say realistic, but like I think ties into probably what our preconceived assumptions of an alien invasion would be like. Whereas this is sort of attempting to be rooted in reality. You know, it's got some. I wouldn't say it has something to say about the Cold War, but at least uses the wake of the Cold War as like a setting. Whereas like Independence Day doesn't do any of that. You know.
Well, and I think, you know, Adam, this came up when we were talking about Independence Day on your episode, that like Independence Day, I think, is the warmest blockbuster ever made. And one of the reasons that I think none of these movies can be ignored outside of the context in which they exist. And so like this movie is made in a post Michael Bay world, right? We have like well and truly entered this like dark nihilist period of American blockbuster. And Independence Day is kind of like a fairy tale. I totally agree with you that there's like an American exceptionalism thing in that movie, but the fact that it does sort of play with the idea of world politics and people coming together to save something, to do something, feels like, yeah, it's a fairy tale, but it also feels good. This movie is purely like America's going to solve the problem. The Russian president is viewed as this like kind of pawn, this sort of like negotiator figure. He's not really fully established. He makes no sense as a Russian president, right? Like he doesn't
no,
like
and he
really
like refers to the US president as a hero in like the first few minutes of the film.
Exactly.
And I'm just like, this feels so like unlike the reality I've existed in.
You could view him as like you could view it as kind of like a Boris Yeltsin Clinton kind of relationship, but it's so much less nuanced than any of that. So and I think, Adam, your point is well taken that like it faints at real world issues. It faints at conflicts within the former Soviet Union. It sort of like looks at ultranationalism as a real issue. It gives Oldman lines where he critiques America in like thoughtful, interesting ways. But at the end of the day, he gets punched in the face and thrown off the plane by the president, who says, "Get off my plane," right?
And they also have Oldman saying stuff like, "I would turn my back on God himself for Mother Russia." So it's sort of like anything this guy says, we cannot and shouldn't take seriously, because at the end of the day, he's a Russian extremist, and therefore his opinions aren't valid.
Yes.
And to be fair, he's also murdering people on the plane and hijacking the plane, and he's doing some actively bad stuff that we don't agree with. But
so I'm wondering if then passing through how you guys have just explained that I think perhaps the issue for me might be, okay, Independence Day is essentially it's a fantasy, right? First of all, it's science fiction, fairy tale, kind of broadly appealing and therefore sort of inoffensive to some extent, right? Even though it's very rah-rah. Top Gun, you know, somewhat of a fantasy, I would say, and it's also not, it's just more about like, it's, you know, kind of pro-military. And similarly, like the Russians, although they're never actually called like Russians, they're sort of implied to be, you know, sort of Soviet in Top Gun. They're literally faceless. They're just, you know, the MiG pilots, you never even see their face. They're not humanized. They're just, again, the sort of Reagan era generic other that our gallant American heroes need to vanquish, right? It doesn't really bother me. I think it's because it's like, either do it or don't. You know what I mean? Like, are you going to be a Jack Ryan movie and actually bother to make this feel like in any way takes place in some kind of political reality? Yeah. Or are you going to ascribe the kind of simplistic notions of a movie like Independence Day and try to superimpose them on a Jack Ryan type scenario? So I think that might have got to the core of what bothers me. The other thing about this film that bothers me is because as someone that is like, no, you know, not an expert, but somewhat well-versed in the ins and outs of like the US political system. And some of that comes from just like watching shows that are smart, like West Wing, and you kind of learn like how the gears turn, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And all of these characters, the supporting characters, don't feel like in any way like realistic political operatives, to the point that they need to send off for a copy of the Constitution, which, by the way, is like quite small and can fit in your breast pocket, right? Like it's small. It's not like some giant, tomb that needs like loads of legal books, and legal scholars need to come in and like. Obviously, there's like nuances to constitutional legalities, but something like this, it's like just get it out of your pocket and let's figure it out. But it's like shit like that just everybody is stupid. They're all the supporting characters just don't feel like they're worth noting. They're all sort of like just vague schemers, and none of it just feels like tight. Like the bolts all feel very loose in the world that we're presented. On top of the gross sort of simplicity of we're good, they're bad. You know,
right? But I think that I think therefore is a feature, not a bug of the screenwriting. Like, I agree that it sort of like doesn't quite like track for me as, you know, being realistic, but like I do think it's tied into what the film is trying to do, insofar as saying that, like, at the end of the day, we kind of just need a fucking cowboy to lead the charge here, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's presenting all those people. Yeah. We're presenting all those people as ineffectual and needing to be bureaucratic and like, oh no, we can't do anything till the AG comes in here, you know?
Right.
Adam's getting emotional talking about Air Force One over there.
You're so passionate about the role of the Attorney General in...
when he's played by Philip Baker Hall, I'm going to get emotional.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing, though, because it's Philip Baker Hall. So you're like, oh, sick, this rules. It's Philip Baker Hall, like the greatest actor. But it's just like, oh, he's in it for 3 minutes and he's like kind of a dud. I also think it doesn't really do anything with... Like, they don't do a good job of presenting why releasing Radek is that big of a deal. Like, I've always felt this kind of, like, feeling of, like, okay, so he's outside the gates. Like, if he escapes, yes, we know that bad things can happen. But, like, it doesn't... The stakes aren't high enough, right, for the release of Radek to feel... Because she says something smart. She's like, we will fucking get that guy, and we'll get him in, like, in no time at all. Because it's true. That's what would happen. That guy would, like, take off in his helicopter and be pursued by, like, American attack helicopters and be shot down immediately. Like, it doesn't really... The stakes aren't high enough with the decision to make Radek's release that big of a deal.
And it's again what you brought up earlier, Liam, the fact that we don't see or hear any of what the evil acts that he has been kind of like overseeing. They're made reference to, but they're never sort of made tangible for us. But I think the reason why it's presented this way is to be a counterpoint for the power of the president. Like,
yes,
if the film is pitching to us that like this one incredibly like cool and powerful guy can like do all this for our side, we need to make sure there's no equivalent on the other side. We need to make sure the only people in power around the world are people that we can refer to as puppets.
Well said. Yeah, 100%.
So the hero of this movie, Harrison Ford, as the appropriately blandly named James Marshall, like could have less specificity.
President name generator.
Yeah, totally. An AI figured that out. They got Watson to figure it out.
John President, right?
Yeah, exactly. His name is Harrison Ford. That should be his president name. Exactly.
You know, there was a point, though, that I wanted to mention about this. You know, this character, we don't know too much about him. Like, to my knowledge, I don't think it ever specifies which political party he represents. To me, he kind of feels like either a conservative Democrat or a liberal Republican, right? He kind of feels like very, very in the middle, moderate, right? I think it's interesting, though, that the one thing that we do know about him is that he is a veteran. And yet, now this to me was very interesting because there's a lot of presidents in the 20th century that were veterans, right? Like Eisenhower was, JFK was, Lyndon Johnson was, Nixon was, Pacific War. Gerald Ford was, George H.W. Bush was, and then, but Clinton was not, and most of the others, George W. Bush was in the Air Force Reserve, I think, but most of the others tend to come from a different background, more like legal or business or whatever, right?
Right.
So it's kind of interesting that, like, to me, though, it feels like so foreign for a 90s president, which were like Independence Day and this guy, the idea that they would be war veterans feels like weird to me, even though it's like historically kind of like there is precedent for it. You know what I mean? So there's something about that I think is kind of interesting, that maybe there is some, you know, I remember that was like a big tenet of John Kerry's campaign, right? Like that he was
that didn't work out.
Vietnam vet, right?
Yeah.
It's part of the dialogue in the American conversation. There's something about that gives you an immediate credibility and gravitas, right?
I get what you're saying though, about it feeling off though.
Yeah, right? Why is that? What do you think?
I guess because I would say the reason it feels off, but the reason why it is functional for the film, is that these are essentially peacetime presidents, right? Like the Cold War is over. It makes more sense you have like the military leader as your wartime president, right? But like we're now past that point. This is meant to be the period of peace, and like that peace is sort of like an element of of his like mission statement as a leader. So it does feel a bit weird that he has that military background in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like an interesting moment to kind of think a little bit about like what we think of what's the role of a president, right? Like I do think that, like, you know, growing up, this is 97, right? So Clinton's the president, right? And for many reasons, Clinton is like the beginning of this, not the beginning, certainly in history, but like of the modern era. It's like that's when things start to really get nasty. I was raised by like very Democrat-minded Massachusetts, you know, Democrats. JFK. My dad cried every year on the anniversary of JFK's assassination, right? So I was raised by like very blue traditional Democrats. You know, my politics are similar, but probably not exactly the same as theirs. And so I do think that the point that you made earlier, Adam, about how people were kind of uncomfortable with Clinton, right? And they thought he was like a little, like, made people uncomfortable. I feel like maybe that this president is the answer to that, because this guy's tough. He's a veteran. He just wants to watch the game and drink a beer. But at the same time, he can't tolerate genocide. Like, it's kind of a problem with the movie, is that it's like very watered down, right? Like, Phil, to your point, the reason you can't tell what his politics are is because they don't want you to be able to tell what his politics are, because they want you as the audience to be like, oh, he's a Democrat. Like, I want him to be a Democrat. Someone else might want him to be a Republican. Like,
he hates genocide and injustice. He must be a Democrat.
Right,
but he was in the military. He must be a Republican.
Right,
you know, like,
exactly.
So it allows
there's something
you,
for everyone.
Yeah, to sort of project your fantasy is sort of sufficiently bland and amorphous that you, the viewer, can project your fantasy of a president upon him. Right, like he gets to be a sort of cipher or avatar for that perfect president.
Yes,
which is morally just and does the right thing against his political interests.
Right.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's like relatable. Like he's, you know, he likes a beer, he likes watching the football, but also he's been in the service. So, you know, it's just like some very basic things that people. I mean, George W. Bush's whole thing was built on those types of box ticking, right? Oh, let's have the thing where he flies the plane onto the aircraft carrier, big show of that. He's the guy. Karl Rove famously said, like, he's the guy you want to have a beer with, even though actually he was an alcoholic who didn't drink, recovering alcoholic, right? But it was all part of it was like, these are the things that American voters attach to. Military service, sort of an earthy relatability and a kind of cowboy masculine toughness. That's like that's pretty like basic view of what certainly post-Reagan, like what the American voters are perceived to want in a president. So it's kind of interesting how this film like threads the needle.
Well, can I also say to that point, my dad was born in 1942, right? So he saw the first ever televised presidential debate, right? It's not that far before this movie comes out in the annals of history that suddenly, like, you were looking at the president on television every day, or the president was constantly like, you know, so in some ways, and you have Reagan, right? The first sort of like movie star president. So in some ways, like, Reagan creates, I don't know if Reagan does, but like suddenly the president becomes a media figure, right? In a way that like he wouldn't have been in the like when I was the age that this movie
isn't
came
that
out.
It's JFK though, right? Where that kind of starts becoming the thing. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's like, and like of course it was JFK. He's handsome, right? He's young. He represents sort of like the right kind of like look for a president, right? Like the idea of electing a president that young feels kind of unheard of now, right? So we're sort of in the early era, I think, of presidential media presence with this movie. And that can be hard to remember because, you know, it's not that earlier. And of course you put Harrison Ford in this part. Of course it's Harrison Ford. Like, even though I don't know that, even though I'm not like a huge fan of his performance in this movie, and I think that like he may be in some ways the problem with the movie, of course it's Harrison Ford.
I think he's really good in the movie.
Yeah,
I said to Liam, like, I feel like Harrison Ford's house, he like gets this script, reads it, and is like, this is a hit. I'm gonna have to do it. You know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't feel like he just knows it will work because it's such a bulletproof premise, right? And he knows that is a guy, and we talked about this with the great movie stars had that similar quality that we just talked about, where you project yourselves into them, especially if you're like dudes, right? Like every dude, remember the famous scene in 500 Days of Summer where Joseph Gordon-Levitt's really feeling himself after like sleeping with the girl he's in love with, and he sees his reflection, and it's Harrison Ford as Han Solo, right? Because everyone wants to be Harrison Ford, right? Because he is just like timeless, cool, American masculinity, right? And I think, what we were saying earlier about like the Reagan thing is interesting because Reagan, coming from the movies, and he did work like for the army that was like media type work, understood that to some extent the president is a character in the minds, in the theater of the American psyche, and he attuned his image and persona a little bit to that, the sort of tough talking cowboy, but also the kind of like wise, joke spinning Irishman you can have a beer with, like that. It's like he understood that was like, that's what gave him like 2 terms. He could connect with voters on that level because there is an element of persona being part of the tapestry of that kind of interrelationship. But
there's a great essay by Robert Greene, who's a documentary filmmaker and makes these very sort of like hybrid documentary fiction films. And he wrote an essay, I think, for Sight and Sound in like 2016 that was like, or 2015, like Trump the media character and why he appealed to people. Because like most people are never going to meet Donald Trump. Most people are never going to see Donald Trump. And yet he lives rent-free in the minds of so many people around the world, right? So it's like, yes, I think that's one thing we don't acknowledge is that, like, to some extent, he's a real person, and to some extent, he's a media fabrication, right? And what is and therein maybe lay the problem for these kinds of roles.
It's also worth noting that the original Kevin Costner, I think, very similar to Harrison Ford in a lot of ways. There's definitely like clear distinctions between the two of them, but he was the first choice, and he turned it down, funnily enough, to do The Postman. And which kind of set his career back for a long time before, he kind of like climbed back to the top, but recommended Harrison Ford for the role. But there were a bunch of other actors that were considered, like apparently Gene Hackman, who would go on to play the president in Absolute Power, a much more cynical and nasty movie.
I
mean, that's a more fitting tone for him as president, you know?
Totally. I mean, that's
and especially coming from the lineage of those 70s paranoid thrillers, right? That he was so kind of associated with. But a bunch of others.
I also just can't see Hackman like, John McClaning his way through the annals of Air Force One and assassinating Russian terrorists and stuff.
Ford
doesn't quite track for me.
He's definitely 55 when
older.
This movie comes out, right? But he looks great. He's got that salt and pepper hair, or actually, he's
the weird thing is Gene Hackman and Harrison Ford actually are like maybe not that far apart.
12 years, 10 to 12 years, yeah.
Because we did Narrow Margin where Gene Hackman, who I think was only about 50 at the time, but Gene Hackman's just a guy that perennially looks 55, like for 40 years. Like
it's weird to think that we're not all that much younger than Gene Hackman, but because we're raised when we look like 22-year-old boy. Like, look at me, I'm 42. Why do I look like this? Like it's a legit issue.
But apparently Schwarzenegger was considered as well, which might sound crazy, but actually, became, governor, right? So, it's just interesting to think of, well, what would it have been if it was some of the other people that were considered? Tom Hanks was considered. Tommy Lee Jones was considered.
I
could see a Tommy Lee Jones version of this.
I got to be honest, I don't think this film works
it would
without
be a
Harrison
different
Ford.
movie.
Yeah, I think ultimately, Adam, you're right. Even though I don't love things that he does in this movie, like,
I love everything he does in this movie.
I think the thing
for all of the issues I take with sort of like what the film is like saying and doing, the actual experience of watching it is kind of unparalleled. Like this movie fucking rocks, and he's so much fun to watch.
I agree with you, and I have a really good time watching it. And it's similar to Independence Day. If you turn your brain on for more than a few seconds, you're like, oh yeah. But it is a blast, and I think it's because Harrison Ford. And then maybe we can move on if we're up for it. Is like,
go ahead.
He contains the multitude of being the toughest guy in the room, and also the guy, like, the moment when Oldman has the gun to his daughter's head and he says like 1, 2, and then Ford goes, "I'll do it." Like that is a great acting moment. That is quintessential Harrison Ford, because he can go from being like no to being like teary-eyed, and it's like he's such a great actor. He is such a great actor. And he can pull that off in the same 3 minutes of film, and that's not to be undervalued as a performer. He has such access to how he feels, and I think that's why he works here, because he can both be the tough badass who flew more missions in Vietnam than anybody else, and also the family man. He's like the perfect facsimile of the middle-aged, tough American man who could kick my ass. You know,
he's brilliant. He is brilliant. And if you study his performance in this film, there's just a lot of it is just doing that McClane-esque creeping around, but being incredibly present in the way that he's doing that. Like, he's not just like, I'm going to walk from point A to point B. He's carrying all the terror and the angst and the weight of all of the stuff that, you know, is going on for him psychologically. So it's in no way to like diminish or deride Harrison Ford's performance in this movie, because he is great and he is the reason that this movie works. But it's just, you know, there's I think as a overall in its totality, there's just like something about this that just kind of rubs me the wrong way. That said, this is still a really, really well made, well acted, brilliantly crafted movie. You know, I just have some like pearl clutching to do. Let's talk about the villain of this picture, Gary Oldman as Egor Korshunov. For once, worth noting, you know, we've done a lot of these movies in the post-Die Hard realm that were with villains that weren't motivated by ideology. They're voted for, like Gruber, they're often just for money or, you know, some sort of opportunism, or a slight combination of the two. Like, say, Sean Bean in GoldenEye, right? There's like, I'm going to get some revenge on people, but mainly I'm like here to rob some shit, right? But this is an explicitly ideological, ideologue, right? Like, really hardcore, hates the US for what they did to Mother Russia, criticizes US foreign policy succinctly with one memorable line. But it's a strong performance, of course. It's Gary Oldman, but it doesn't have. I think one of the reasons I don't like rewatch this movie is because he doesn't have any of the depth, charm, or wit of a Hans Gruber. He's just a sort of relentlessly angry, one-note psychopath, and kind of a stereotype at the same time. Even though it's an excellent performance from Oldman, of course, you know. So, what are your thoughts on on all that and this character?
I mean, I guess it's what you've already said, is that there's in Die Hard you have the reveal that Gruber is essentially like a gentleman thief, like leading a heist, versus he's got the cool suits and the cool watch, all of which like become part of his downfall, right? Like, but in this, there's no further reveal. Like, I actually spent like when I was really keying into on this viewing how similar, like beat for beat, moment for moment, how similar this is to Die Hard. I kept waiting for like the reveal. Like, what's the thing that's going to happen that's going to take this character to like the next level? But instead of there being a reveal, there's just escalation, and like the escalation is fun, but like there's nothing to it beyond the fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I want to point to one scene that I think details what's wrong with this character, and it's the scene where he's talking to the first lady and the daughter, right? And he's like, talks about how he has children and all this stuff, and it's like, it just sits there. It's not threatening. You know he's not going to do anything to the little girl, right? And he does this thing where he like leans in, and for a second you're like, is he going to kiss her? And then he kisses her on the forehead, and it's like, that scene is just dead on arrival to me from the very first frame, because we don't have an expectation. The movie's not going to allow him to murder a little girl, right? Like, that they can't cross that threshold. It'd be too far. It would kill the movie, right? This is a Hollywood movie made in 1997. And I think Oldman, with no disrespect to Wendy Crewson and the daughter, but like, I'm sorry, it's got to be Ann Archer. Like, this is another problem with this movie.
They're pretty.
It's a B- casting choice. It's totally.
That's not where you should have, like. It's weird though, but it's weird because in their defense, great actors. You just mentioned like Philip Baker Hall and Dean Stockwell and that sort of murderer's row of like the people that are in the cabinet, and they're just not like, they don't get a scene where they get to like really cook. It's just vague scheming. You know, Glenn Close is the only one that kind of like has a bit more to do and is, you know, but for the most part, there's just no like really juicy. Everyone's kind of in third gear. You know, the whole movie. The movie's just in third gear.
Moment where Oldman says something about her sweating through her blouse, and it cuts to this shot of Glenn Close's face, and like, that's a really good moment because she looks like she's about to explode. And there is a little bit of like the only woman in the room, no one takes her seriously stuff going on in this movie that like it could have gone a little bit further with, like, but it doesn't quite get, like, she's kind of like what's the term, gaslit a little bit by everyone around her in this movie.
I mean, it's incredible that like this film has this sort of, you know, I guess this is sort of a thing that we keep going back to, the idea that the movie keeps alluding to bigger ideas and then not really paying them off. But it's like, you have Dean Stockwell coming in and saying like, I'm like not cool with you running the show here. Like you need to step out of the way, even though you are the vice president. And like, you are sort of, and you have you have Oldman essentially being misogynistic in the way that he is talking to her. He's not giving her shit because she's the vice president. He's giving her shit because she's a woman. And it's like you are waiting for that to develop into something, and it doesn't.
Right.
It's also you know, a year before this, you have Mars Attacks, where Glenn Close is playing the First Lady. And doing, you know, an incredibly like huge broad comedy performance, and then here is doing something entirely different. And I mean, it's an amazing sort of you know, two sides of the coin to sort of see these two different roles back to back.
I like Glenn Close. I think she's a good actress, and I think she's always like kind of lived in the shadow of other actresses, which is not a comment on her at all, right? It's just the reality of when she came up. But I do think this movie does hint at like sexual work politics being or sexist work politics, I should say, being really problematic. But it doesn't. Maybe that's hindsight. Maybe that's 20-something years of hindsight.
We tracked this a little bit in like, say, like our episode on Turbulence, right? Where we started to, it was like the wave was just starting to crest of like, you know, we're now sort of post a massive reckoning on this stuff. But in the late 90s, they were sort of vaguely like, what's going on here? It was sort of like, we'll look at it a little bit, but we're not going to really shine the spotlight on it, is sort of what it felt. But I think Glenn Close is terrific in this movie. I think it's one of the strongest performances in the movie. And she's well cast because she just always comes across as like powerful, you know, just a strong, incredibly strong screen presence and you know, an excellent actor. Let's talk about the action briefly. As an action movie, how does it compare to other Die Hard on a Plane movies for you guys? Like, what are there set pieces you really like in this movie? How do you feel it actually functions on an action movie level, the action itself?
I feel like the hijacking itself is the high point action wise, because it is just, you know, it's very Die Hard-esque. You know, you've got all of them rushing through the corridors. You've got the smoke grenade. You've got the, you know, the unveiling of the traitor and the, you know, the hidden arsenal of weaponry. And, you know, it's an incredibly well done, very tense, you know, like 8.5 minutes of screen time. And I don't think anything really matches how cool that is. I think there are scenes that should match how cool that don't quite get there because of the use of not quite ready, you know, visual effects work. I would say the closest you get to that level of tension in an action sequence ever again in the film is when they almost successfully land the plane, but then like take right off again. Although I guess that's kind of a continuation of the hijacking itself. But it's all of that stuff is the real juice for me.
I agree, and I want to give a particular shout out to the reaction shot of Ford in the war room or whatever that meeting room is on the plane, hearing the gunfire and the look that comes over his face, because again, that moment is full of dread. Like that's that would be a terrifying thing objectively to see, is a bunch of dudes rushing in for assault rifles right on a plane. Like the terror of the Die Hard on a Plane concept is the close quarters of it, right? Now I would say that this movie does not this movie does not exploit it in, say, the way that I think the king of this genre is The Executive Decision. I would say that that's probably the best Die Hard on a Plane of the 90s. I'm trying to think if I'm forgetting any movies, but I think that that's the best one. And I think that movie just does the cat and mouse stuff better. I would also say that I think the decision to parachute people off the plane at around the midpoint and then dispatch of Oldman about 20 minutes before, and we get all this like the Xander Berkeley betrayal, and like it's about 20 minutes too long, maybe. Like I feel like there's like a back end that doesn't quite click for me. And I think the getting the people to parachute out of the plane, first of all, talk about the visual effects looking spotty. That woman like it's like that's a rough shot. But it also just like, I wanted the juice. I want Harrison Ford beating the shit out of Gary Oldman, and that bit distracted me from it. And the last thing I'll say, William H. Macy, every time he's on camera, I'm like, oh, it's William H. Macy. Oh, there's William H. Macy. Like, I'm not thinking about this as a character. He's not Paul Guilfoyle, who immediately, great actor, but immediately disappears into the background, right? Like, I think that is just something that sticks out to me. Is there's a lot of things getting in the way of this movie just cooking, in my mind.
Yeah, the action, in my opinion, weirdly, the film actually gets better when Gary Oldman's killed off, because I quite like, not no disrespect to him, because obviously he's very, very electric screen presence, but when it becomes more of a disaster movie in the last 20 minutes, I actually quite like that. I think that's like really good set pieces, the refueling of the plane, the sort of dogfight.
The refueling stuff's awesome.
That stuff is really good.
I agree.
But
totally.
where executive decision soars and this kind of sputters is executive decision used actual practical shots of fighter jets behind the 747, and this cheaps out with some CG stuff that has aged horribly.
And I'll say I picked up the new 4K transfer of this, the new disc, and like everything that is celluloid and practical looks incredible. And the visual effects look, they are glaringly bad. It's like the case of where, like, the last time I watched this was probably on like an HD stream, and I as much as I love watching things in with the high dynamic range, color grade, etc., like, I actually think that you're probably better served by a compressed HD stream of this that don't highlight quite how poorly those effects have aged.
Sometimes too much definition is not good. Like, I think that's kind of like, because seeing this on the big screen, it looked gangbusters, except for the plane crashing.
What was that? 35 mil?
35 mil. Yeah. And we should say this movie was shot by Michael Bauhaus, who shot.
Yeah, he's doing great work.
He's an amazing cinematographer. He shot some of Scorsese's best movies. Yeah. My favorite Scorsese, The Age of Innocence, which is absolutely beautiful. He also shot a lot of Rainier Fassbinder's movies from the 70s. Like, this movie has a crazy production team making it. And sometimes it looks so expensive. Like, one shot I just want to point out is the helicopter flying towards the White House. Like, that is like, holy shit. That is like next level. Like, this is big production value kind of stuff going on here. But
it's weird that some of it feels like 100 million plus, real like production value driven blockbuster, and some of it feels really kind of cheap and chintzy because of that, just the era in which it was made with those effects. Let's put on our tuxedos and head over to the Die Hard Oscars.
Okay, let's put on our flight parachutes. Our parachutes and our bad suits.
So, what do they call the White House Correspondents' Dinner?
Yeah. Who's
the first award? The first award. I'll do a really bad job of it. The John McClane Yippee-Ki-Yay Award for Best Line. I have like 4. There's one obvious winner here.
Yeah, we know what the winner is here.
But let's just do it anyway. Some of the other nominees, the bit where Igor puts a gun to the First Lady's head and says, "I think he'll negotiate," was pretty strong. And then the line that actually was quite good. It's also pretty memorable, where he goes, "You who murder 100,000 Iraqis to save a nickel on a gallon of gas are going to lecture me on the rules of war. Don't."
More of that, please. There's also the moment when he talks about this infection you call freedom, without meaning, without purpose. Like, you could write a dissertation on that line and what it means, but the movie doesn't do anything with it because it has to be down the middle.
That's what I was saying earlier about the politics sort of being like, we've decided to do Team America World Police. This sort of like, we're just going to go around, we're going to, do whatever acts of violence we want in the name of freedom. And, that's that. But again, the film has no interest in really exploring it beyond like the speech at the beginning and that monologue from Oldman, towards the end.
Right. 100%.
The next line I have is, "If this works, you get to be Postmaster General," which President James Marshall says to the
it's so funny.
The lady who like figures out, I think, how the fax machine works or some shit, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, the one that we're all waiting for. Does anyone want to say it? I'll tee it up for you.
Get off my plane.
Yeah! Woo! so stupid.
It's so good.
It is good. It is good. It is really good. Yeah. There's a whole direct-to-TV sequels, not directly, but there's like Air Force 2, and there's one that came out last year called Air Force 1 is Down, which actually speaks a little bit to what this movie kind of is, which is like an elevated direct-to-TV, with no disrespect to that genre. But that's kind of what it is.
The next award is the Hans Gruber Exceptional Thief Award for stealing the film. I've got 3 nominees. Gary Oldman as Egor Korshunov, Glenn Close as Vice President Catherine Bennett, and William H. Macy as Major Norman Caldwell, the U.S. Air Force aide to the president. Thoughts, picks, noms?
Yeah. I mean, it's got to be Oldman. I think the only other person we haven't mentioned at any point really is Ilya Baskin, who I just always love seeing in anything because he's so compelling in those Raimi Spider-Man films.
Yeah,
that his performances in movies like these retroactively get like more fun for me. I
totally agree, and he's like a classic. Oh, this guy's in that movie, right?
Exactly.
Like I think that's a really good pick, and what a kind of interesting actor he was. You don't see guys like that as much anymore. They're only in Marvel movies for 2 seconds.
Yeah, exactly.
The Dick Thornburg Award for Dick of the Movie. Xander Berkeley as the traitorous Secret Service agent Gibbs. Dean Stockwell as the opportunistic Defense Secretary Walter Dean, throwing down some Al Haig vibes. And Steward Joey, played by Fenton Lawless, for spoiling the score of the game that the president wanted to watch. I hate that shit.
You hate it because you feel bad for the president, or you hate it because you hate it when that happens?
Yeah, no, I hate it when people do it. I had to turn it off on the TV had a setting that was like, would spoil the scores. I had to like turn it off because sometimes you can't watch games like live. You have to like record them and watch them later. Like it's just the way life works, unless especially on a Sunday. So that just like that triggered me.
I will give it to you.
So he'd be my pick, but would you have a Dick of the Movie?
Adam?
I would go Stockwell. In a movie that explored the character and a little more, I would go Xander Berkeley. But I feel like because we know absolutely nothing about why he's done any of this or what it is that he's doing specifically, it's sort of like, well, I guess in that scenario, he's just sort of like another nameless henchman who happens to have betrayed the president.
Yeah, has no motivation, right? Like,
exactly.
It doesn't even touch on why he does it.
He just sort of is vaguely a traitor. So I got to go Stockwell, who's trying to use this as an opportunity to seize power.
Just a very quick shout out to Jürgen Prochnow, who plays Radek, who's in this movie for about 3 minutes, but is a legendary German actor from Das Boot specifically, and also has a few scenes in The Keep, the Michael Mann movie from 1983.
More than a few scenes. He's
like my God, you and Phil need to talk about The Keep.
I love The
Keep. Oh man.
Well, I have thoughts on that might come up in a potential future bonus episode. Is The Keep Die Hard in a keep?
Oh my God!
German bad guy.
Oh my God!
I love it. It's so great. I've watched the opening sequence of The Keep like 50 times. It's incredible.
I saw that movie on 35 recently on the nastiest, most fucked up print, and
I don't think there's a good print of that movie that exists. There shouldn't be a good print of that movie. It
has to feel like you found it in the back of an alley, and like
that is what it felt like. It was transcendent. I saw it with Dom actually. Yeah, it was a great screening.
Oh, great. Amazing. Love that movie. A beautiful mess. Best death is Marco in the House.
No more table! Next time you have a chance to kill someone, don't hesitate. I almost did Oldman, but it would like midway through I would have abandoned it because it would have been really bad.
I felt that energy. I felt that. Yeah. Speaking of Jürgen Prochnow, Radek being shot in the back trying to leave prison. One of the better sequences in the movie. He doesn't. I don't think he says a single line, does he, Jürgen? He's just kind of there, like
he's got that face.
Wolfgang hooking him up with a nice paycheck. Igor being choked by the parachute, and the one that I thought was actually pretty great, pretty spectacular, was Agent Gibbs, Xander Berkeley, presumably dying as Air Force One crashes into the sea, and pretty spectacular.
Nah, he made it. He's definitely alive somewhere in the ocean. That guy's
coming back
great
for the sequel.
Yeah, Xander maybe.
That'd be my pick. Yeah.
I don't know. I gotta go Oldman just because the Berkeley's death is so overshadowed by like the polygonal PlayStation 1 Air Force One bouncing off the ocean surface.
It's like a jet moto sequence. Yeah, totally.
It's really weak
Siphon
sauce.
Filter. Let's take a quick break and then come back for our last section of the show, the Double Jeopardy Trivia Quiz, where the scores can really change. We'll be right back. And we're back with our last section of the show, the Double Jeopardy Trivia Quiz. You guys hopefully know the rules by now. No gouging, no no biting. Okay. 3 quiz questions.
Choking by a parachute. Yeah, totally.
3 quiz questions. You get 1 clue each, and you guys can and must collaborate. Okay, I'm going to skip the first one. It's too easy. I'm going to go for the second one here.
Well, come on. Fine.
Oh, you want it? Do you want it? All right, I'll give you the easy one.
Yeah, I want it.
All right, this is a warm-up. Question number 1. Alan Rickman was cast in Die Hard after his breakthrough stage role in the RSC production of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, which member of the Air Force One cast starred in the 1988 film adaptation of that play.
I actually don't have any... I mean, I'm going to have to assume it's Oldman, but, like, I have no idea.
Do you know, Liam?
Glenn Close.
Is correct.
Yeah.
Ah, very good.
Mm-hmm. I almost said Xander Berkeley just to keep people on their toes. But
it's... Question number 2. Air Force One features Xander Berkeley as a traitorous Secret Service agent. In which previous Die Hard on a Blank film covered on this podcast does fellow Air Force One cast member Bill Smitrovich also play a traitorous security agent who betrays the politician he's supposed to be protecting?
This is all you, Liam. I have no clue.
Nick of Time
is correct. In which our boy Smitty plays Officer Trust. Do you ever see that one, Adam? Nick of Time?
No, I've never seen it.
Real Terror in Real Time.
It's an interesting
pretty
movie.
Good.
You should. It's yeah, especially at this exact moment in time. It's an interesting movie. It's a sort of like Die Hard at a presidential convention. Essentially, it's kind of interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. It's pretty interesting. Our final one is my personal favorite. Okay, question number 3. Air Force One features a scene where the president is trying to watch a college football game on the flight. One of the football teams playing in that game also features in a college football game being watched by Eddie, the front desk security guard in Die Hard. Which iconic college football team connects the 2 films?
I mean, I know one of the teams playing is Michigan. Like, that's the thing I remember. I don't know what the other team is. So if it's Michigan, then that's my answer.
You are correct, but it's the other team. It's the other team.
Notre Dame.
It's correct. Yeah. Well done.
Yeah.
Well done. Yep, the game on TV in Die Hard is USC versus Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Very good.
There we go. That about does it for today's show. You guys...
I know you have to go, but can I just... There's just one thing I got to bring up that we haven't hit on. Have either of you listened to the rejected score for this film composed by Randy Newman?
I heard about this, but I haven't listened to it. Wax on.
So there is an entire score for this movie written and composed and arranged by Randy Newman. It is wild. It's very different. It's like super dissonant and strange. And Peterson, I guess, rejected it because he felt it was a parody of the movie he was making. But I found, I did some deep forum diving last night, and I found that there was a guy on Vimeo who has reconstructed a few of the scenes from the movie with the Newman score. It's totally wild, absolutely like worth checking out. I'm going to drop a link in the chat here so you can both give it a listen. But it's just such an alternate reality version of the film.
I am blown away by this. I like the idea that it's like, you got a terrorist on the plane. Like, it just feels like it could be total. It's like, it could be out there. Oh my God, this is incredible. Air Force One. I'm going to check this out. So you can't get the score anywhere. Someone just reconstructed it.
I think there's a couple of tracks that are available online, and I did even find a review of the whole album. But you can't obviously you can't watch the movie with this score. Right. But
not yet.
Yeah. Not yet. But thanks to Otisberg on Vimeo, you can watch a couple of these scenes.
Amazing
doing
stuff.
yeoman's work. Thank you, Adam, for joining us again.
Absolutely.
You guys plug your episode of ID4.
Well, it's the greatest movie ever made. No, I mean, these 2 movies are in conversation. I was so glad to come back and talk about to be on the show and talk about a movie that I love to my core, warts and all. And I think that it's a fun little crossover to do that one week and Air Force One the following week.
Absolutely. Yeah. Total pleasure. Thank you both so much for having me back. I'm sorry that Dom couldn't make it. And you can check out Eye of the Duck anywhere you get podcasts. We release new episodes every Monday. They're a week early and ad free if you're on Wondery Plus. And you guys are on a couple of our episodes. We've got Liam on for ID4. Phil, we had you on for Highlander. We had both of you on for Total Recall. Did we do another one?
Well, let's just keep this collab going.
Yeah, we'll keep doing it.
Good.
Yeah.
You guys are our official Harrison Ford correspondents.
Hell yeah!
So,
I mean, that's a title I'm happy to have. Proud even.
Yeah, well, it's you can do
it's
a lot worse.
It's an honor and a privilege.
Yeah. Get off my podcast. I had to do it. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, guys. This was super fun.
Great. Thank you, Adam, for coming on the show, coming back. Sorry we missed you, Dom. Feel better. I don't know what else to say there.
We can sympathize as dads dealing with the plethora of infectious diseases.
I've been lucky lately, but that probably just means I'm going to be on death's door in about 472 hours. That seems to be how it goes.
But Dom was missed, and we were thrilled to welcome Adam. Their show, Eye of the Duck, is fantastic. A wonderful film show that basically takes the concept of what is the scene at the center of a movie and uses that as a fantastic jumping off point for a really, really great movie discussion show. And they have really cool themes and miniseries about different subjects, whether it's cyberpunk or alien invasions, which is the one you guys are currently doing. Great show. We fully support them. Any last comments? Rate, review, subscribe. Find us on various
social media platforms. We got a nice email from a gentleman the other day named Dan. Dan, he said, "You guys do a fantastic job. It's the right amount of humor and appreciation for the movies you cover." And apparently he found us because we were suggested as a podcast next to Blank Check, which what auspicious company to be in.
Indeed.
So thanks, Dan. Blank Check, and thanks, Dan.
And thanks to Tyson
Hubley, as always, doing our cover art. The guy is the man. We love you, Tyson. Next on the show.
It's a biggie. It's Would You, Adam and Eve. It's our 50th episode. It is, quite a milestone for us. We've done 50 of these. We hope to do 50 more, maybe a few more after that. We will see how it all goes. But for right now, we are doing The Jackal.
The Jackal.
A movie I love.
And a movie I don't love.
But there's a big helicopter in it. And, that's pretty much all I need. But I love this movie. Liam, not so keen on it. We've actually already recorded this episode. It's a fantastic conversation. So please join us for our 50th anniversary extravaganza. No gifts, just come as you are. Everybody welcome. And
we'll be back next time with celebrated American theater actor Steven Spinella kissing Bruce Willis on the mouth. Die Hard on a Blank is a podcast created and hosted by Philip Gawthorne. Liam Billingham co-hosts and produces the show. Mike Mayer and Michael Sugar are the executive producers. Find us on Twitter and Instagram at DieHardOAB. Rate, review, follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, tell your movie podcast-loving friends about Die Hard on a Blank. See you next time on Die Hard on a Blank.